Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker for the first session. The session is entitled Understanding the Impact of Investigator-Initiated Clinical Trials and Registries. The first speaker is Dr. Neil Soderlund. Neil just sauntered in about a minute ago. He said, "I've never seen people so pleased to see me." We were very anxious that our first speaker wasn't going to be here, but he is here, I'm pleased to say. And it's been a pleasure to know Neil and get to know him and work with him over the last year or so, or the last couple of years really, as we work with him in his role as a founder and managing director of Health Outcomes Australia. He is currently a senior advisor in the Sydney office of the Boston Consulting Group, and his work currently focuses on the development and use of information in healthcare, especially with regard to improving patient outcomes and value for money. He was previously a partner with BCG, that is Boston Consulting Group, leading their healthcare practice for Australia and New Zealand. And he's undertaken over 80 projects in the healthcare strategy, and pleased that we've been involved in a few of them. So Neil's talk is entitled The New World Order, Welcome to the Era of Outcomes and Value. Please welcome Neil.
Thanks very much, John, and hello to everybody. It's great to see such a large audience on this topic. I'm going to be taking you on a 30-minute whiz through probably the last 10 years or so of my life and some of the things that I've been doing with colleagues around the world. It had previously been called, I think, something a bit more boring like health outcomes and value-based healthcare, and Rhiannon and John souped up the title of my talk to no doubt attract you all in, but I hope to live up to the title. Now, the first thing to mention is when we talk about value in healthcare, it seems like such an obvious proposition that when you present this to people outside of the health sector, they say, well, that, obviously, surely that can't be new. You must have been doing this 50 years ago in healthcare. What's the big deal? And it really is a very simple proposition we're talking about. Trying to improve the healthcare system so that in the numerator of the equation, we improve outcomes to patients, and in the denominator, we reduce the costs incurred from that. And it is still something that is very much at the forefront of transforming healthcare for a couple of reasons. The first is that the numerator of that equation, the outcomes dimension, is far from being evident to most people working in the system, whether they be clinicians, hospital managers, people manufacturing or supplying goods into the sector. Because we have you could think of it as a value chain across which multiple players play a part. And at the end of the day, the only person who really knows what the outcome is the patient themselves. It is quite a complex and not often done activity to figure out what the outcomes are. But the second reason this is not just a no-brainer and requires work is that putting the outcomes dimension and the cost dimension together in decision making is still unfortunately very rarely done in the health sector. Most of our clinical institutions and unfortunately a lot of our research and administration institutions in Australia still divide themselves into a cost management team, which is a bunch of finance and accountants and economists sometimes, and a group of clinicians. And they each focus on one half of this equation, and they try to stay as far away from each other as possible. And because we can never bring those two sides together, we cannot make a lot of the decisions that need to be made rationally and for the benefit of patients. So I'm going to go into a bit of detail around some of the work that we've done to try bring this equation to life. First of all, a couple of definitions. What do we mean by outcomes? And the simple way I try to define outcomes is it's things that matter to patients. If you're talking about some dimension of healthcare that if you told it to the patient, they would say, huh? Or, I don't really care. And, in that group, you would put something like an HbA1c measurement. A patient would say, well, I don't really care what my HbA1c is. I'm feeling good. So we're talking about things that matter to patients, and this is really the end point that we've got to aim for in healthcare and not stop short of it. Mortality, I think, is important, and nobody denies that. But also things going wrong are important, and avoiding those things going wrong. And sometimes those things go wrong due to things we do in healthcare, and sometimes they do go wrong because of omissions in what we do. But lastly, we also need to spend a lot more effort and time asking patients how well they're doing, both before and after healthcare and over the course of a series of treatments. And we often call these patient-reported outcome measures, or PROMs. And this includes things like health-related quality of life measures, measuring people's functional ability, and measuring their economic activity and ability to participate in society and in education if they're younger people, and generally kind of engage socially. So really, these are the things that we've got to try to measure up against the money we're spending on healthcare. And that's in many ways the quest that we have posed for ourselves. So is there an opportunity? So for me, this is the most inspiring slide to kind of drive my work. It's a slide of the variation in both outcomes and spending in healthcare across the OECD. And you could probably do exactly the same slide, but instead of having countries as the dots on the slide, you could have LHDs across Australia, or you could have hospitals across Victoria, and you'd get a similar spread. So there is an enormous amount of variation in healthcare, and that's often seen as a bad thing. And we certainly things like the Safety and Quality Commission's Atlas. It's there is a very explicit aim of reducing variation, but variation represents the opportunity for us. It means that some people are doing a whole lot better than others, and somehow we've got to try to figure out what the difference is in what they're doing in order to replicate those best outcomes. So this analogy is stolen from a colleague of mine, Caleb Stow from ICHOM in Boston. Some of you might have seen it before. If so, apologize, and all credit to its originator. But this is a photo of the first Olympic Games, the 100-meter sprint. And what you can appreciate at this stage is because we weren't in a globalized world then, these people had never raced against anybody else outside of their country before. So, and this is the start, and the obvious observation from it is that they all have a different starting style. Now, does anybody want to hazard a guess as to who won the race? Yep, that's right. It was the guy second from the left. He was actually a guy called Thomas Burke from Boston, who won the race. His starting stance looks a bit familiar to us. But now let's see, there was obviously a lot of variation in that first instance. Let's see what's happened to that variation 100 years later. So this is the start of the 100 meters in the 2012 Olympics. I should update this one for the 2016, but I don't think it'll look very different. You can see that variation has been completely eliminated. Certainly to the eyes of someone like me, the experts might well be able to spot some difference. And this is what happens when you essentially, you repeatedly feed back information around variation and the impact of that variation on outcomes. The outcome is very clear in this kind of competition we're talking about here, who gets across that 100-meter dash quickest. But the other important thing about elimination of variation is that you eliminate towards the better practices and you drop off the poor ones. So this slide actually shows the results of that 100 meters sprint, and it shows them as the number of meters the medal winners in each year would have been behind Usain Bolt when he won in 2012. So you can see that down at the bottom of the slide, Thomas Burke, that guy who had the good starting position, actually would have been about 20 meters behind Usain Bolt if he'd been racing together with him. So we get this dramatic improvement over time by comparison, and obviously starting position is just one feature. There are kind of tens, if not hundreds, of other kind of characteristics and styles that have gotten this improvement. That's exactly the kind of thing we're trying to replicate in healthcare by comparing outcomes. You can see that if you didn't have the outcome measurement, you could never actually get there. But the fact that once you have a clear outcome measurement, it becomes very, very easy to distinguish the good and the bad practice. So in the healthcare world, I think the question of variation is well explored. Almost all of you will have seen work done on variation. We already know, we can have a good guess at least of the causes of a whole bunch of variation. The one very obvious one is the whole experience effect. So clinicians and hospitals who do lots of a certain procedure or treat large numbers of a certain patient type get better at it, and as they do more of it, and they get better results. And this is a slide drawn up in the Netherlands looking at breast cancer surgery, and it's the percentage of patients in the left-hand slide that have residual tissue left over after surgery, residual tumor tissue, that is. And you'll see with the smallest hospitals have the highest amount of residual tissue left over, which is a bad outcome, and the largest hospitals have the least. Now, and that's pretty intuitive to most people. But probably even more interestingly, if you look at the right-hand slide, you see that actually there's enormous variation in all of those. So there is other things at play here that are as important, if not more important than the volume that each hospital is doing, that are driving outcomes that you need to understand. And that understanding those factors is a perpetual and ongoing thing in healthcare. It's not something that we're going to do a randomized control trial on once and find it. There is constant evolution of both the technology and the practices of clinicians, as well as we're constantly raising the bar in terms of the improvement we want to get. So that, studying variation as a kind of routine practice within healthcare is really, to my mind, the place we're looking to get to. So many of you will also have been at many talks like this before and say, well, I've heard that before. This is a repeat of the whole kind of evidence-based medicine movement and clinical effectiveness, et cetera, and we've been repeating these activities kind of in a slightly different kind of guise pretty much every 10 or 15 years. And that's true, and I've been through a few iterations of that myself. I think there are a few things that are changing right now in the world and in the last kind of 5 to 10 years. There is certainly a lot more ambition for making change happen, and I've noticed that change, and that's not just an Australian phenomenon. If anything, I think some other countries have overtaken Australia in terms of ambition on that dimension, particularly continental Europe, which often wasn't that enthralled with this concept, say, 20 years ago. The things that are driving that, there's a recognition that clinician change management is a very important topic, and that clinicians typically, if they've been educated in a kind of Western scientific style, have an evidence-based approach to making decisions and to managing their patients, and actually you need to have an evidence-based approach to managing change with them as well, and that's much more effective. Obviously, health systems are having to make decisions as well, and that is often in the context of financial crises, we often call them, but there is an ongoing imperative to improve efficiency regardless of that. And we also think, obviously, about the long term now, so we're able to project forward with aging populations what our future costs are going to be, and roughly what our future rates of economic growth are going to be, and that drives ambition in this space, because the numbers just don't add up. The other thing we're seeing, though, is a scale potential where a lot of efforts which used to run locally are being run at a much larger scale now. And this is, probably the essence of something like what ACTA does, is bring together multiple researchers, multiple sources of data to collaborate on combining the data to get real results in a small number of instances rather than no results in large numbers of instances. One of the institutions I'll be talking a bit about later is called ICHOM, is essentially developed to enable aggregation of initiatives by standardizing the measures that they use. The third and very obvious one is technology. If you digitize health information, suddenly kind of geography is no longer a barrier, and you can actually start measuring and comparing at a global level instantaneously. And notwithstanding the pessimism that often surrounds e-health and the digitization of healthcare, actually we've moved a long way. I've been in Australia 16 years now, and we've moved a long way in that period, and most health information is now digitized, with a few exceptions in Australia. Our issue is now getting it aggregated together and using it, not in getting it into bits and bytes in the first place. Okay, let's dig down a bit into some of the outcomes themselves. The mortality one is obviously critical, but aiming just for mortality is not going to push the boundaries in a lot of areas of healthcare. And this is just at the very highest level, looking at the improvement in potential years of life lost, which is essentially premature mortality, across all OECD countries over the last 20 years or so. And you see each of the countries starts off as a pale dot and becomes darker as the years move on. And they pretty much all start at the top left-hand side of the curve and move down here. But you'll also see that with each extra year, this curve is flattening out. And that's because actually we're getting much better at preventing premature mortality. The outlier here is the US, which, as you can say, looks pretty flat, just at a much higher level of spending per capita. And that has just operated in a different kind of cost dynamic to most other countries for a long time, as many of you will know. And Australia is pretty much in the middle of this pack, actually probably towards the bottom end of it, which is good. So we're actually doing a little bit better than average in terms of outcomes, and certainly not the worst in terms of expenditure either. But, in a lot of conditions now, and some of the malignancies are perhaps the best examples of this, we've had to shift from focusing on mortality as the important outcomes to other outcomes. The chart on the left shows a comparison of 3 different settings for mortality outcomes, survival outcomes for prostate cancer. And you'll see that pretty much everybody is getting a 94, 95% 5-year survival. So this is across Germany, Sweden, and then the largest prostate cancer provider in Germany called the Martini Clinic. But once you start looking at, in fact, the more subtle outcomes, and we've looked at 2 here, which are pretty consistently amongst the most important for patients themselves, incontinence and erectile dysfunction post-treatment, you see very different outcomes. With the Martini Clinic, which has really dedicated itself to measuring and improving practice in this space for the last 20 years, getting results that are, a quarter to, a third of better than any of its 2 national comparators here. And this kind of phenomenon is repeating itself across a lot of other malignancies, and increasingly across chronic disease as well, which is obviously an important driver of overall well-being. I don't want to foreshadow the debate that's happening this afternoon, but I certainly have a strong belief that in many instances, quality improvement is actually cost reducing as well. This is a slide that's a little bit dense, I'm afraid, but the charts on the left show essentially 2 sets of outcomes for people with cataracts. And these are measured before and after surgery. So the dark green bars are before surgery and the light green are after surgery. And the 4 clusters of bars, the IG1, IG2 through to IG4, are different severity grades of cataract. And it's a standard classification used for cataract grading. And you'll see that in the top 3, you actually get an improvement in each of those outcomes. So, you get a reduction in the symptom load and an improvement in independence. But actually, in the lowest cataract grade, people got worse after surgery. So their cataracts weren't severe enough for them to benefit from surgery, and actually their vision was worse afterwards. And this is a group that was routinely at that stage being operated on in Sweden. And we figured out that if you were to take the Swedish data and apply it in Australia, and just eliminate that group, you'd save, by a combination of avoided surgeries done and improved outcomes for that group, about $8 million a year. It's not a massive amount, but it's actually both a quality improvement and a cost saving. Interestingly now, in Sweden, the proportion of cataract patients who have a low-grade classification is measured as a KPI in the health service. So if you're doing too many of these low-grade cataracts in your hospital, you actually get called out in the national health statistics as being wasteful. So this is kind of already, this slide is from results over 10 years old now. This is now translated into policy and practice in the system. Another example of Sweden, and forgive me if I use too many Swedish examples, although my name is Swedish, actually I have no other real links to Sweden other than a distant ancestor. But Sweden's been a really good example of building kind of outcomes tracking mechanisms in a very practical bottom-up way. And as a result, they've got evidence that is probably 10 to 20 years ahead of the rest of the world in this area, so I do tend to rely on them a bit. This shows the mortality post-acute myocardial infarct, so post-heart attack in Sweden on the left-hand side and in the UK. Over roughly the same time periods, a roughly 10-year period at the beginning of this decade, and it's the percentage of people dying post-infarct in the first 30 days after the infarct. And you'll see in the Swedish example, there is both a steeper decline in the rates and there is a narrowing of the variation over that period. So once you get, the variation is about half in 2010 of what it was in 1999 or so in Sweden. And you might ask, well, what is the difference between these two settings? The interesting thing is both of them were actually measuring outcomes over this period. And that's what enabled us to draw this chart. But in the UK, what they were doing was publishing these outcomes as league tables on a website and in a book that went out every year, together with about 500 other books of that type. And in Sweden, they were feeding back the information personally, face-to-face, to the department heads in all of these hospitals. And this is not a conclusive proof at all, but we certainly have a very strong hypothesis that the personal feedback of outcome information is quite a critical element in getting improvement. There is such a deluge of printed material, whether it be research or opinion pieces or kind of statistics on your performance that the average clinician or hospital manager gets presented with. You kind of have to break through that to get really pretty personal with people around their patients and exactly what happens to those patients to get the impact to flow through. And that is, to an audience here, which I imagine has a fair number of researchers amongst it. This to me is really a kind of call to arms. Are you doing research which is showing the kind of thing on the right without it getting the kind of personal feedback and flow through to kind of generate the results on the left? And I personally think we have a lot of opportunity in Australia to shift situations like we have on the right to one on the left through feedback. I've lived here for 15 years and have lived in the UK and in South Africa before that. And I've found Australians generally significantly more squeamish about having these discussions in all kinds of, and I've worked as a management consultant, so it's not just in the health sector the last 15 years. They're more squeamish about having discussions that affect personal kind of results and performance in a way that actually is useful to people. And I think the health sector is no exception from that, and there's definitely room for improvement there. Just out of interest, if you then apply that to the kind of the value lens to that observation around measuring and feeding back outcomes, we took that data and said, well, what would happen if over the next 10-year period, so from 2010 onwards, the British actually did the same thing as the Swedes and fed back the information, and we got the same year-on-year improvement. And that works out to saving roughly 4,000 deaths over that period in the UK, a population of just over 50 million. And it's worth about $1.6 billion over that period as well. So I mentioned to you a bit about the standardization point, and as many of you will know, there's enormous enthusiasm about measuring outcomes all over the world and including in Australia at the moment. And that has resulted in lots of new initiatives, but historically the problem with new initiatives is if they've used different measures for outcomes, it's very difficult to actually combine the data and make significant results. The great thing about the cost side of the equation I showed you earlier is that pretty much everybody measures costs in dollars. So, if we're within one country or even between countries, we have exchange rates which allow us to compare those very directly. But we don't have that for outcomes. And ICHOM is an organization that was set up jointly by 3 organizations, Harvard University, Harvard Business School, and Michael Porter's group there, BCG, and the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, which is the Nobel Prize awarding institute in Sweden, and launched ICHOM, which is a non-profit that works to standardize outcome measures for clinical conditions. And it essentially works through between 6 and 10 new clinical conditions every year with global reference groups. And I'm sure there are people in the room here, in fact I can see some of them, that have worked on various of these standard sets. And these standard sets are meant to be a minimum standard set that covers all the dimensions of outcome for a given condition. So they cover both the clinical outcomes and the mortality type outcomes, as well as the patient-reported outcomes. And they also capture the relevant risk factors that need to be adjusted for in assessing those outcomes so that you can make the comparable. So essentially what you get out of them is a minimum data set to collect. These ones that are shown here, it's a bit out of date, the slide, so some more have come out in 2016 and are planned for 2017, which you see at the bottom. Some of those 2016 ones are actually already out and in use. But we certainly would be advocating for people to move on to these outcome sets, or at least putting these as a minimum subset of the outcomes that they're collecting, both for registries and for trials, in fact, because it enables much greater comparability of the data that comes out of those. This is, once again, a bit out of date, but this is uptake of standard sets around the world. I think it's probably impossible to draw this slide now because it's kind of really taken off. But you'll see, a fair representation of Australian organisations in the bottom right-hand side of that chart as well. So where might we get to with this? This is, once again, apologise, a Swedish example, but this is a book that is published by the Swedish, what's called the Swedish Association of Local Authorities and Regions, which is really the kind of the aggregate body of the municipalities in Sweden, as well as their national government. And it has about 400 pages of comparisons between every region in Sweden in terms of outcomes. And these are, they cover everything from population health, health behaviours, clinical and patient-reported outcomes, but they actually show data on every region for all of these metrics. And it is the norm, in a sense, to both have it published at this national level and to have individual feedback based on these. And this is just an example of a couple of pages out of there, the bowel cancer outcome measures, which is kind of the top chart there. You probably can't read, shows the 5-year survival rates, and then each of the regions below that, so the improvement over time and the regional comparisons. And on the right-hand side is the one I mentioned earlier, which is the visual acuity of people undergoing cataract surgery, so an indication of how much wasted surgery is happening. So that's all I really had to discuss with you. I'd love to catch up with some of you in the lunch break or afterwards to discuss further. hopefully this gives you a kind of a bit of a background canvas for the more detailed discussions for the rest of this day today. Thanks very much.